Okay, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chantal Dresner, and I'm the Marketing Director at BioSpace, and I'll be moderating today's session. This is the future of biopharma, laying the groundwork for a post-pandemic workplace, just to make sure you're in the right spot. Just a few housekeeping notes to start. Attendee phones are in listen-only mode today. However, questions are welcome, so please do submit them via the chat and we will do our best to answer them in our Q&A at the end of the session. If we do run out of time, we have a lot to talk about today. We will try to address any questions in our post-event communications. The webinar is being recorded and all registrants will receive a link in our follow-up email. I'm going to be referencing a couple of recent reports as well that BioSpace released this quarter, and we're going to be providing links to those reports, which are free to download in the same email. So for those not familiar with BioSpace, we are the leading news and career site for the life sciences community. We have about 1.5 million life science professionals active on the BioSpace platform each month. And we also produce research reports on recruitment, compensation benchmarking, and topics pertinent to our community. And that includes 2 recent reports on COVID-19 and how it has affected biopharma employers. And that, of course, brings us to our event today, the future of biopharma. Our recent COVID reports really highlighted some key issues that we are looking forward to discussing today with our panelists. And we do have a fantastic group assembled here today, and I really thank them for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourselves before we get started?
Sure. I guess I start. I'm Rachel Lahaney, and I'm the CEO of Calcimedica.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Linda Fitzpatrick, the Chief People and Communications Officer from Sutro Biopharma.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Dr. Michael Tkach. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Behavioral Health Officer for Affinity Empowering.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pete Mariani. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Axogen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Raj Cannon, the CEO for Chiasma.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really thrilled that you're all here. We do have a lot to discuss, so I thought we would just jump right in if everyone's happy. So just to kind of place everything in a little bit of context and start us off, I wanted to ask some general questions in terms of how you feel the pandemic over the past year has really impacted the industry's workforce. You know, for some context, what have been your key challenges and how have you been addressing them, and how do you anticipate addressing them going forward?
Well, I guess I could start off. I think from our perspective, if we go back to the beginning, we had a couple of key things that drove us first. One, we had a sales rep test positive for COVID very early. And we realized pretty quickly that we couldn't be bringing COVID into our hospital customers. So we brought our sales reps home very quickly and asked them to creatively find a way to continue to support the customers and their patients remotely, which is things that they had not done before. And over the next several months, we were amazed with the creativity that was brought to that. And we were able to continue to be, very engaged with our customers, very engaged with one another, because we ended up doing an amount of training with our sales reps because they weren't traveling, they were at home. Mm-hmm. And so we did some remarkable things there that we had never done before, and it turned out to be a very, very positive time, in a very negative environment, but a very positive time from the standpoint of being able to find a way to support customers in a difficult time. Now, obviously, like everybody else, we had to send everyone else home and work remotely, and we found a way to do that and be as productive as we can in a difficult time. But for us, it was also a situation where our revenue was really hurt pretty dramatically in April timeframe. And as a cash burning company, it meant we had to move very, very quickly to protect our cash and extend liquidity. And again, a lot of creativity on the part of our staff to figure out how to focus on the things that we must do to support our customers and their patients, and put off the things that could wait till later. And we were able to do that, and I think got through a time frame in a constructive way.
So I would add to that, Chantal, in terms of one word to describe it, what has the pandemic done to our workforce? It's dramatic. It's unprecedented. And I think similar to what Peter said, it certainly brought at the start of the pandemic a lot of uncertainty and risks across our business in terms of how we should operate. But more specifically, it has had significant challenges both at the personal and professional level. And I would say it's been especially hard on single parents and families with dual careers and young children or elders in their care. And I would say that recent data that I've been looking at suggests that the pandemic has been especially hard on working mothers. And just like Peter, at the business level, we saw a significant disruption in connecting with customers, hiring our employees, onboarding, running accounting audits at the end of a quarter, really upgrading our IT platform for cybersecurity to enable remote connectivity for our employees. And I think some of the challenges, the biggest challenges we faced as a management team was to keeping up the morale and engagement with what we felt were our employees were physically and mentally exhausted, trying to adapt early on in the pandemic. And certainly with the second and the third surge, it did not certainly make it easy for company management to kind of keep their focus on employees' well-being. I would say that looking back now at this point in time, certainly many of us have coped well with the challenges, but I would say that some of us have pivoted quite well. And in the most recent employee survey that we sent out in our organization, I would say that the productivity of our office-based employees was not impacted as much, and I could even argue that it was slightly higher during the pandemic.
I think one of the key things that makes this industry unique is the fact that we basically deal with hospitals, we deal with patients, and the impact. So you had the double thing that the customer or whoever you're dealing with, in our case, we're doing clinical trials, was dramatically impacted. We were dealing with hospitals that are overwhelmed. Many people had to stop running clinical trials because hospitals couldn't do clinical trials unless they were COVID studies. We got into a COVID study, and then the expectations about what you would do in this scenario changed. I mean, my board kept saying, well, how come we don't have people going to the hospital to collect this data? And we were like, because they won't let them in the door. So just the act of doing even a clinical trial in the subject where there were patients, just that changed. But a lot of people had to just put other trials on hold, and now even the interaction now with that body, those hospitals is I think permanently changed. I think the way people think about how we're going to go forward is going to be different. You're going to have to be prepared to be completely remote. Whereas in past, you visited the hospital, you made sure that your drug was being used properly, or your device was being used properly. You talked to the doctors. Now it's all remote, and it's gonna be a change. It's gonna be a dramatic change. I mean, there are efficiencies, but there are also this sort of lack of control that people are having to sort of overcome.
And have there been any conflicts or particular challenges with employees that have required looking? Linda, I know that you're.
I think the biggest one is that for us, and I'm sure it's true when you're selling a product, whatever, you want the data, like who's using the product, how many patients, what do they look like, can we get their files, whatever, and these people are overwhelmed, and you're not there in person to kind of sort of say, hey, can you get that data entered into the, we really need it. You're just harassing them by phone, and they're overwhelmed. And it's unclear to me how long it's going to take for some of these people to recover, because what they went through was just, beyond hell. And how much the medical community was really put upon. I mean, these people are going to take a while to even recover. So I think that sort of dynamic of like, hey, can you get this for me yesterday, is going to have to sort of change, if you will.
I think the entire pivot to Zoom as sort of the central way to communicate is going to have very far-reaching implications. And there was no playbook when we all started this in March of 2020. I think for most of us, myself included, I really expected this to be a fairly short-term event that we would all quickly pivot from and recover from. And so for us, in thinking about sort of how do we keep the essential operations going relative to our innovative research discovery, and in particular our manufacturing capabilities relative to providing clinical supply for our clinical trials, just had an never-ending source of challenge. Just as you thought you sort of had a roadmap, the landscape completely changed. So I would also say that for our team, there were differences, right? And we're an industry that likes to think about all in. And in this case, we couldn't all be in. Some of us could be in and some of us needed to be in. And those that couldn't be in felt non-essential at first. You know, that was a word that we used a lot, right? Essential. And in our teams, right, everybody plays an essential role. But the reality is some essential people needed to be on site and some didn't need to be. And I think we're still sorting through those challenges. Recruiting has been a major challenge as well. How to recruit and onboard and assimilate all via Zoom. And then when somebody comes on site, to have it feel like Sutro for us has been a real source of challenge.
And in terms of remote work, because that's something that, you know, you have all touched upon, are you planning on having longer term remote work policies? Is this something that you envision that you're going to just continue on, pandemic or not? Or are you really targeting to bring people back into the office as soon as is feasible and safe to do so?
Well, okay, I'll go first. We are working to bring people back into the office. We know it's going to take some time. Quite honestly, it's just going to take people time to get used to coming back into the office. So we've empowered a team of folks across our organization to think through what that means, kind of take into consideration some of the things that Raj was talking about, because this has been hard on families. It's been hard on single parents, and you know, we want to get people back in the office because we think that collaboration is really important. You know, most of us are fast growing and fast moving companies, and you need to be with people to ensure you maintain that culture, that innovative culture that we all have, and also to just take care of one another and make sure that we're getting on with these projects very well. And we know we can't do that in a virtual environment when you're back in a growth mode. So we'll figure out how to do it. It'll take time. My guess is, though, the idea of 8 to 5 in the office all the time for everybody is probably not going to be the model as we move forward.
And I would add to what Peter just said. I think there's going to be an increasing shift in how we define or the how we work together versus the where we work together, right? In terms of the physical space. So pre-COVID-19, we all just were sort of robotic, got up in the morning, got through those mindless commutes, had those, you know, drab conference rooms with those mindless meetings, the unhealthy snacks. I don't think anybody's going to miss that, but I think as we start thinking about the future, I think we ought to keep our mindset open as CEOs and leaders in terms of thinking where our employees have shifted to, and not necessarily stick to the same old definition of the traditional work model. And here's an irony that I would put out there as an example. As a CEO, I tell my field force constantly how to adapt to where our customers are. And if our customers are using more telemedicine and telehealth, we're teaching them skills about how to sell in a virtual environment. And I think as a CEO, it behooves us, or senior leadership, it behooves us to also make sure that we adapt to where our employees are versus our employees adapting to a single CEO mindset that basically says, I hate to say this adage, but if I don't see you, that means you're not working. And I think we've got to go past that. And the last 14 months, if there's anything, if the pandemic has proven, is that we've been quite effective and quite productive in our jobs working remotely.
And that definitely resonates with some of the research that we have done. When we surveyed our community members, 40% of them consider working remotely very important to them. And, almost 30% have a preference to continue working from home. So it does seem like something that people are sort of advocating for and are hoping will become more permanent.
I would say we've had 4 recent hires, and I think they'll all plan to work from home. I mean, for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm.
The other nice thing is, like, you'll be on a conference call, and then you'll realize that 3 of the 4 people on the phone are actually walking their dogs at the same time during the conference call.
Multitasking.
It doesn't seem like the worst thing in the world. It's hard to take notes, but.
I would say another benefit of this is that when you really think about it, the way that a lot of service care, the provision of care is going, does incorporate a lot of these technologies. It is virtual. It is meeting patients where they're at. It's actually bringing, healthcare and different types of services directly to them. And so there is an added benefit of, maybe an unintended benefit of having the workforce more virtual, because you're better understanding the end user experience. If you're struggling going ahead using Zoom and you're saying, okay, I got to remind myself not to be on mute, and you're struggling and say, oh, I don't want to use Teams, or I don't want to use Zoom, or whatever, it puts you in the mindset of the actual patient that you're trying to reach and trying to actually make sure that you're putting better service forward for. And it challenges you to say, okay, what is that lived experience? How can I not be so removed and just think of, I'm going to provide this service and I know what they need, but instead flip it around and have that empathy from being in that position and say, okay, technology is the vehicle. How do I make sure that everything's delivered in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, for us, building on the comments so that the panelists have shared, it's a challenge, right? There are certain things that really are better done together. And while Zoom provides an opportunity to be together, it's really not together in the same way. So, I'm going to be interested. We are, taking a stance of everybody does have a path back into the office, and most people are back now, not on a full-time basis, but on a fairly significant regular basis. As mentioned, there are certain teams that actually need to be back every day in just exactly the same way, and some where we can have more flexibility. And I think that's going to have some unintended opportunities, but also unintended challenges as we sort of try to integrate what's right for each individual approach and what's right for the company. So we're really still wrestling with that. I think we're all looking for the playbook, and there is no playbook. And it's going to be different for different companies relative to, your cultural imperatives and the things that you found to be most important. I'd love to add that, our high-tech counterparts, I think, have a completely different read on this situation. And there is no way we would have had 3, 4 exciting vaccines developed had everybody worked at home during this entire period. So just a shout out from my perspective to our entire industry for having the wherewithal to figure out a way to work smartly, to work safely. Employee safety is such a key concern of all of ours, but to continue to advance these life-saving medicines that we're all so passionate about as well.
Yep, if I could add, Linda, based on what you and Peter just articulated, keeping it flexible and keeping our options open and trying to find out what's best for employees, it's definitely the game plan that we're all on right now. But importantly, I would say that at least in my experience and some of the data that suggests that when you had an employee that was just 1 floor up, we basically did not communicate with them as much as we did, right? So we used to always have a challenge of teams that are working on a single product or a project, the medical, marketing, the operational folks all together in one space. And then if you even separated them by more than 100 feet, the physical distance alone was as good as being on Zoom. You could have been in a different country for all we care, right? So I think we just have to keep those things in mind as we start thinking about bringing all of our employees back, and how do we really engender that trust that you talk about, that rapport, that building the bridges with our employees so that we can get that right social connection, so that we can be more productive and creative.
Right. And no, Raj, I think that's a really good point. I think about the people that are newer in their careers who really do need sort of that mentoring that happens in the hallway or over the coffee machine. The ideas that get shared just in a passing conversation, right? Those are opportunities that we don't have in the same way as with Zoom. So I think the challenge is, how do we take the best of what Zoom offers with the best of what an in-person experience offers as well?
I'd love to pivot back to something we were mentioning before about, COVID-19 safety policies. I mean, this is a big question that I know a lot of businesses have been wondering, and a lot of people are still very undecided on in terms of how to approach COVID-19 safety policies and new policies being implemented directly related to COVID-19, in particular vaccination policies. What are your thoughts and approaches that you are thinking you're going to take on vaccination policies? Is this something that you think you will be mandating, leaving completely open? Any initial thoughts on how you're going to approach that?
Yeah, I could jump in here. So with Affinity, we've gone through and we've been working with companies also to develop their COVID strategies on how to stay open and how to continue to function during this environment. And when consulting with them to set up their strategies and then to help run it, we started off by looking, if we kind of go back and then we'll get to the vaccine in a moment. We started looking at what are the different safety procedures that we can put in place and what are the actual objectives of the business. There are a lot of CDC guidelines with social distancing, with who, as we mentioned earlier, who's essential, who's not essential, who can work remotely, setting up hand sanitizing stations and whatnot. And we helped develop other types of strategies as well, and including like non-overlapping shifts and making sure that we keep cohorts together so there's not cross cohort contamination. If we do end up having a positive, it's more likely to stay contained. And different strategies like that, as well as many people went with different testing strategies. Some went with a return to work strategy where they would test people if they want to bring them back into the office to get a baseline saying, does somebody have COVID? Are they coming up positive on any of these COVID tests, with a variety of tests, whether it's a PCR test, an antigen test, or whatever option they decided to go. Whereas other industries were going with the stay at work policy, which is basically continued, or what we call a stay at work, where it's continued monitoring, where you're testing everybody either weekly or a couple of times a week. And what we really saw there was that it was depending on the industry that they were working in. If they were key person dependent and they didn't have a lot of flexibility in their workforce, if somebody went out or if they didn't have a way to absorb the work, a lot of times they went with that continual monitoring. If it was larger and they didn't have as much dependency on the individuals, they could easily flex and redistribute work. They went with that return to work strategy. Mm-hmm. Now, what it did is it created these different types of pockets. And what we saw, especially when there was unions involved, that there would tend to be a different type of approach where it would tend to gravitate towards more of that continual monitoring. When we start talking about vaccines, a lot of companies are going back and forth. Do we make vaccines mandatory if people want to come back to work? How do we go ahead and do we want to take the liability of verifying that everybody who says they're vaccinated actually is vaccinated? What do we do while we're figuring out the length of the vaccination effectiveness? Is there other types of like antibody testing that we need to do or things that we need to consider? And then what do we do when there's a percentage of people who opt out of for various reasons, either religious belief, cultural beliefs, personal beliefs, or just not being interested in taking the vaccine? How do you manage that? And there's been a lot of different approaches. And what we tend to see is that these other safety measures aren't going away. People, because of the variants and how many people are being vaccinated and the prevalence of that, these things like masks and social distancing and testing are things that, especially if the union involved, that people are advocating for, saying we need to ensure that everybody's safe. Mm-hmm. And we're not just tailoring towards the people with vaccines. So it is creating kind of more challenges. I know everybody wants to get back to the way things were before, but there are some obstacles and some challenges there, but not insurmountable ones, just more thoughtful ones.
Yeah, I'll just say from our perspective, we're just encouraging people to get vaccinated. I'm vaccinated. I'm a big advocate of the vaccine. Our leadership team is all vaccinated. And we're continuing to make this a personal choice for our employees, and we encourage them to evaluate the data and make that choice for themselves. We've got a medical director and medical affairs team that has, for the last, ever since we got started, they've been creating communication pieces for our employees and their families to help them understand, first of all, what was the virus all about? Now it's about all the technology behind the vaccine and why we consider it safe and effective. And we've been doing a lot of lunch and learns and other events. And we had one yesterday where we had, we're a 400 employee company. We had 100 people on this one call, listening to our doctor and others talk about the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine and encouraging folks to get vaccinated. From our perspective, this is just our perspective, I think it's going to be better if folks make this decision for themselves. I think the fact that that these vaccines are not fully approved yet by the FDA, and it may not be for another 12 to 18 months. We're using them under an emergency use authorization, which is great. But there are really smart people who are skeptical. And we just need to keep working against that skepticism with data and allow folks to make that decision in their time frame. And we're working through policies on how we relax our COVID protocols within the building based on whether or not someone's vaccinated. It's one of these situations where the CDC has clearly said you can gather, fully vaccinated people can gather in a room and have a meeting without a mask. But then the question is, you don't want to create an environment where you're asking people to put their hand up in a room whether or not they've been vaccinated, and then find maybe two younger folks in the room haven't been, and they're going to force everybody to put their masks on. So that creates an environment that we don't want. Mm-hmm. So we're not walking away from the mask requirement within the company at this point, and we'll see how it evolves over time.
And I think that's the challenge we all have, right? To the comments that were just articulated, I don't think any one of us is going to be able to mandate We'll have to look at the sort of in the legal lens as well in terms of how that field is evolving. Because we'll have to check and make sure from a liability perspective, all of our focus is to keep our employees safe and healthy. Without necessarily using the word mandate. So I think Peter's words about strongly encouraging vaccination to the extent that they can make their own decisions, that would be great. There's just a couple of things I would like to comment on to Michael's point. I think return to work, we're very careful in how we use those words because all the people have been working remotely. So the office is not the place where we work. So it's always return to the office because we've all been working our tails off during those 14 months and everybody's exhausted trying to manage sort of our personal and professional lives. The other thing, I think there's some multiple factors to consider when we think about coming back to the office, right? The safety is key. And so we're working again, like to Peter's point, from our company's perspective and our property manager, how do we constantly sanitize and clean the workspace? Whether there'll be a need for social distancing, if there's a second surge, like a variant that takes off, or if one employee has COVID in the office, what's the immediate protocol? Touchless controls, we're working even in the hallways and the restrooms, what safety measures do we need to put in? So there's a whole host of things that we're working on in terms of employees returning to office. But I go back to Linda's point, we're going to do it in a phased manner, very slowly, baby steps, one step at a time, no mandates that all 100% of employees come to the office and no mandates that 8 to 5 will happen. So I think it's an evolving field, but I think the common theme you're hearing is that we're going to encourage everybody and modeling that practice is to get vaccinated first. So we're all vaccinated in the management team. So we hope that our actions speak louder than words.
Raj, we followed a very similar approach. We stand at about 92% of our team now being vaccinated. And I would say we got there largely by leading with example, providing resources, particularly when the vaccine was more scarce, about where you could get vaccinated. A strong educational component. We have a really active COVID-19 advisory committee that's chaired by our chief medical officer. So we've really approached this from the science and really have tried to do a lot of employee education. We do check-ins to ask people with no inferences made, have you been vaccinated? And within those communications, there's very much a strong bent towards we're really encouraging everybody to get vaccinated. We do plan to bring 14 summer interns on site this summer. And so for that group, there was discussion and a decision to ask each of them to be vaccinated. And I think that's really kind of where we come out on it. It's an ask rather than tell, a strongly encourage, still following every protocol on site, full masks required, social distancing. We've never cleaned so many air handling filters, I think, in our existence. So that continues to be a priority, as does surface cleaning and so forth. So trying to blend all of those safety aspects with a compass towards, we really want you back, and we want you to be able to come back as soon as you're able and as soon as you're comfortable to do so.
We have 100. I think we have 100% of our group is vaccinated, but with a small company, we've been just very flexible. And our, as we're small, our building has rules that supersede, what anything we would put in place. So we've been trying to follow those in the local rules as to when we can return back to the building. So I think we probably could all be back in now, but we're just doing it sort of day by day. And with a small company, a lot of our employees have always been virtual. So the transition to doing things virtually wasn't particularly difficult. Our CMO does not live in California like the rest of us, for example. So, we've been, it was sort of a natural thing to move to Zoom. And, but it is helpful to be in the office to sort of have that connectivity and know what people are doing and not have to sort of constantly be like, wait a second, I haven't talked to XYZ in a day and I better call him this. I've got 6 things I need to ask him, which is, which it does happen when you're not all in one place together.
Not shouting over your desk and
exactly
roaring at people
with your mask on.
Yeah.
And we have called it return to on-site. I really, the point of return to work really resonates with me because I don't think people have ever worked harder. I truly don't.
We are definitely seeing that. And, when we were first approached by a lot of companies, there was in the industry this term, the return to work, which has been stuck and which is used, but it's definitely that case where our workforce as well, you see people putting in much longer hours, much longer, actually being much more productive, working virtually than typically at home. So definitely a case where it's not like work was ever absent. So.
And I would say I think some of the jobs may evolve, right? We have a subsidiary in Israel, and quite a few of our people have a lot of international travel. So it may evolve to the point where you can't escape having a vaccination because it just makes travel easier. For example, in Europe, either you have to go get a test done 48 to 72 hours or self-quarantine or get a vaccination. And I think at some point, people will figure out the incentives for a vaccination the benefits far outweigh the risks.
Yeah. We've actually had a really good question, Raj. I'm actually going to build on that just because someone actually did pose an interesting question about travel. I don't know in terms of whether travel policies have been something that, that you have been considering or thinking about in terms of, are you going to have a sort of general travel policy for your employees that you would like to put in place, whether that's traveling for work or potentially traveling for pleasure purposes?
Look, we've obviously we restricted travel during the heat of all this, and we're starting to relax that. And those restrictions included, if we have employees who have family overseas, and if you traveled overseas, you had to come back in and do whatever quarantine was required before you can come back into our office, especially if it was at our production facility or at our distribution facility. So we've had those policies in place where In fact, actively this week, we're reviewing that to see if we can loosen those up a bit more. Again, leading from allowing the CDC guidelines to lead us. And as the CDC is relaxing those restrictions, we're going to follow suit. And I wouldn't, it's still not open to everybody without some review, but we've got, we're moving back towards a more normalized travel environment, but put a big asterisk by that, because I do think that the concept of normal business travel, if normal is pre-COVID, I think it's gonna be a long, long time before we get back to that. I don't see that. I don't see us getting back to that again.
Although we just made, my assistant was making arrangements to attend JP Morgan next January this week, just in case. And I was like, if you want, have at it.
Feeling optimistic.
But I agree.
And I would say, right, I think many of the things that we do in our industry, like congresses, and Rachel, you just brought up JP Morgan. I'm not sure that I really miss the the 6 a.m.
especially
to like
JP Morgan.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, if I look at the industry today, in 14 months, the number of IPOs, the number of capital raised that the industry has done, they've done it amazingly well, and all on Zoom, right? I know that meeting with my investors on Zoom is so much more effective than having to wait for an elevator for 1 hour during JP Morgan, or figuring out how to take 18 flights of stairs to get to my next meeting or go across town. I honestly think there are some advantages. Yes, you do miss that physical interaction and the connectivity, but there are other venues to connect and interact than, for example, say JP Morgan, where 10,000 people just land into the city and it's just like a zoo.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing perhaps is, as you said, Raj, the congresses and the scientific meetings, right, that really do benefit from the stand around the poster conversations, for example. Financial community, I think, those meetings really are more effective in every respect on Zoom. They truly are.
And there's an equitable part of this, if I might add, right? The equitable part that I think about is not every physician and healthcare provider is able to travel to these expensive congresses and buy expensive rooms. And so even when I think about Boston City, certainly there are, we're all around Cambridge, and you have to be pretty well off to buy any residence around Cambridge to have a decent commute time, right? Same thing with San Francisco. So I think when I start thinking about the equitable part of humanity, I honestly think remote working and not being able and being able to attend a educational session or a scientific session on Zoom is so much better than having to spend the kind of money that everybody has to spend individually to get to these places.
That's a really great point. I'm going to actually pivot to something that I do really want to get to before we run out of time. People have been talking a lot about mental health, and there's been a lot of work around mental health awareness and mental health support. I think we all know that the pandemic has been really difficult for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. Not just the feelings of like isolation and stress and worry, but even people who have been grieving and losing loved ones and been through illnesses. How, as employers, are you looking to approach mental health wellness going forward? I mean, there's a lot of lasting effects, and people have made like a lot of changes to their life, like throughout the pandemic. I mean, I moved to a small town. Who would have thought I could have done that? But a lot of people have been going through similar shifts. And how are you looking to really address mental health going forward and support your employees?
Definitely. I'll jump in first. And I would say that when looking at this, people had numerous different types of experiences. There was not only the actual pandemic and the virus itself, but the economic impacts that so many people face, and the risk of, am I being downsized? Am I losing my job? All of these things happen. And what typically we see when people are working on site at an office is you've got some type of a built-in support network, which can help insulate and help support you. And you've got other people going through it. When you're moving everything virtually, you've got this sense of isolation, the sense of distance of kind of this lone experience that's happening that may not be connected in the same way, and people internalize more. And then we see an uptick in different types of mental health related conditions, such as depression, anxiety, substance use, all of these things where people are trying to contain it and then going ahead and working. And then on top of that, you know, you've got a break in your normal routine, which is also an additional stressor, and that will go ahead and exacerbate any of these types of symptoms or experiences. So, you know, you have people maybe that are getting up out of bed and they're putting on a work shirt, but they're still in their pajamas and they're doing Zoom meetings, and you know, and they're not having that sense of normalcy anymore. And the more we deviate from what that normalcy is, the bigger of an impact that this event has for people. Mm-hmm. So when we think of starting to figure out, like, how do you go ahead and address that? You know, it's about building a sense of community. It's about building a sense of connection. It's about saying, is there stuff besides just meetings where we can have time for our employees to connect? If it is still virtual and not on site, how can they build that connection? How can they go ahead and still have, you know, encourage almost like virtual coffee visits so that people can go ahead and still connect with their coworkers, collaborate, have different ideas, and have a sense of connectionness. And expanding upon that is, what are the resources that we're providing? So, you know, with employers, are, you know, what are the EAPs or the different types of employee assistance programs that you're providing to give resources and support? One of the things that we try to push through Affinity with we kind of support through Affinity, both thinking about whenever we're working with an employer and they're coming up with their strategies, is, can you go ahead and make these mental health resources, whether it's materials, articles, videos, different ways for people to connect, just openly available. So barriers to access sometimes when you're trying to offer something to your employee, you know, to your employee through your employer, are that people tend to hold off on engaging on that because there's that fear, even though there's privacy laws and whatnot, that if I engage in this program, or if I ask, hey, can I have those resources, that suddenly you've been flagged. And now everybody's going to look at anything that you do under a mental health lens, and, you know, is this person okay? And all this other stuff. And so to eliminate that barrier to access, what we recommend is really looking at how do you just make those resources readily available so that nobody has to opt into the program. Mm-hmm. And it's not something where they have to raise their hand and say, hey, I would like to participate in that, but instead it's there waiting for them.
It's about, like, not really adding like additional vulnerability to someone who's already feeling sort of vulnerable.
Exactly.
I think there's so much in this time that doesn't feel regular. We've really tried to build in mental health to every communication, every all hands meeting, just to give voice to it, that this is an area of concern, that we hear you, we see it, we're concerned by it. And it's things that are as simple as, when we launch a Zoom meeting, to just take a moment to check in. How are you doing? It's harder to do when it's a large Zoom meeting, but when it's a smaller one, just a question of asking, and the role that I think each manager can play in doing that. We also added to our portfolio of benefits a new mental health resource that we introduced a couple of weeks ago. We've had an employee assistance plan for many, many years, but this is sort of a higher level of engagement and service that really was, you know, came from just our identification of the fact that this is probably going to be one of the most lasting impact areas for our employee teams, our mental health, and managing the transition into sort of whatever the new normal may look like and may evolve to. So I'm excited to see how that goes. I'm excited to have our employees absolutely have a resource that feels personal and directed to them, and something that they can really access at any point in time.
If I could add to sort of Michael's and Linda's very good comments here, there's just a couple of things I would say, right? I think if there's one thing during the pandemic, we always say people are important, and we always act, you know, to make sure that our employees are well taken care of. But during COVID-19, I would say that for the first time, you know, personally for me as a CEO, I could say that I really put people even in front of results. Right? Even as a starting biotech company, you got to preserve cash, you got to deliver the results. For the first time, I think there was a clear sense of importance of making sure your people were okay, your employees were okay. And also to say it's okay to not feel okay, right? And have that genuine empathy towards our employees in terms of what they were facing. So that was one. And I would say one other comment that I would add to this, what Michael and Linda just articulated, it seems counterintuitive, but it was the first year that I started focusing on something that was not in my vocabulary, to really make sure your employees were not having a burnout or working too hard, because the lines between physical separation of work and personal hours and work hours were starting to blur in many ways. And so one of the focus that I had as a CEO was really making sure to just tell people, have breaks, have blocks on your calendar, like I do. Well, as a CEO, I do have some privileges of making sure that my calendar is not filled up. But for you, you really need to own your calendar. Push back on flexibility, saying that if you can't do it between 2 and 3, then just say, I'll follow up with an email or have a meeting at some other time. So all of those things, I think, to what Michael and Linda talked about, really matters. And it's walking the talk from a leadership perspective that you care about your people.
One of the things that we've done with a number of new hires in particular, but even some people who are at the company, is scale back to like a 75% employment as opposed to a full-time. So, I mean, frankly, everybody who's 75% is working full-time, and most of the people who are working full-time are working 125%. So it's kind of, but it gives people the sense that they don't have to be there all the time. So a number particularly of our employees that have kids at home and things like that, where they've got these other stressors in there, and kids at home, especially little kids, it's just been just really tough for people, obviously. 75%, then if you take time in your day and you're not working, you don't have that crazy guilt or whatever, and so we've done that, and it's worked really. That's been great for a lot of people. People have really appreciated that.
I'm glad you brought up. I'm glad you brought up new hires, because one of the things that we have been asked a lot of questions about is actually recruiting and recruitment strategies. I think a lot of companies were sort of hoping to hire last year potentially, but really put it off. And now, even just in the last couple months, we've seen this really quite intense recruitment drive, and a lot of companies have really focused on hiring again. How are you positioning your recruiting strategies? Did you have to change any of the strategies, and are you planning on changing your hiring strategies going forward? What are your your plans?
I can just say we've been a lot more flexible about where people are. I mean, I think every single one of the hires we've made in the last 12 months have been people that probably will never be full-time in the office. One woman, fantastic hire in our clinical program, lives in Texas. I don't know when she'll be in San Diego next. And she's been fantastically productive. So I think we've taken, and even within the San Diego community, we've hired 2 people who don't really live near the office, and we're considering getting them desks and flex space kind of thing for them, because they don't want to come to the office. They don't want to do the drive, and there's really no reason. Maybe once a week, but beyond that, no reason. So I don't think we would have thought about it in those terms in the past. So that's been the biggest change.
Pete, did you have something to add there? I saw you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, no, I think we're back to recruiting. We're recruiting a lot of folks, and I think Rachel's right. I think it is causing us to create a new filter on all these positions that we open to say, does this need to be an office-based employee or not? And I would say that, look, for our business, for what we do, in the majority of the roles that we do, those roles that were office-based, we'd like to keep those office-based, and we'd like to keep them, located in our headquarters area in Florida. And we've been successful with that. I think there's only been a few folks that we didn't think we could connect with there. But we are opening up that thinking process to say, is this more of a travel role? Is it more of a field support role? And how would we feel about that being more of a remote person? So we're adding that filter to it. But I would say our default is we still want people to be in our headquarters space if it's a headquarters-based role.
Has anyone found it increasingly challenging to find candidates at this time? We recently did a survey earlier this year, and candidates are significantly less likely to be open to new roles this year. I mean, my gut is that a lot of people are sort of still kind of come to grips with everything that's changed. And so taking on, for example, a new role might seem too overwhelming to some people, but we know that the competition for good people has really intensified. Has anyone noticed like a marked shift in their own recruiting in terms of having to kind of like tempt people or incentivize them like a little bit more?
I've definitely noticed that there's a little bit more insecurity with either changing positions or moving positions because of what the pandemic really brought forward was that not every company was as financially solvable or stable as it appears.
Mm-hmm.
And when you saw changes in the workforce and people either being let go or whatnot, it caused a lot of people and candidates that we've talked to more hesitancy to want to change roles or look at other positions.
Right.
And then in addition, when they do go, there's a lot more questions about how is the role now versus what it might be if it's returning back to on-site or in the office. And, what are the pros and cons? If they're really looking for being in the office and being around people,
Mm-hmm.
Are they willing to wait for, to start a role to say, okay, we'll get there someday, but I'm gonna hold on to that. Or conversely, if they're really liking the virtual environment and may potentially need to be an on-site role at some point, are they comfortable saying, well, enjoy it now and then switch later? In a way, you're almost looking for a candidate that's potentially, depending on the role, ready for two very separate work experiences. And there's a lot of trust that goes into that when they're saying, okay, I'm going to go ahead and sign on for this, especially if they have a position that they can hold on to.
Yeah, I think it is extremely challenging. And Chantal, I think you raised an excellent point. There's so much change that people are experiencing right now that the notion of changing jobs is really difficult. It's and there is such a wide variety, right? There's not one right answer. On-site, off-site, remote, hybrid. It's different things at different times. And I know one thing we've got more open positions than we have ever had at Sutro.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is those cycle times for recruiting are definitely taking longer. It's difficult when somebody is in a full-time remote role and has really enjoyed that and not having a commute and other things that affords. Our roles are hybrid at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Some are full-time on-site. If you're manufacturing, you can't do that from your bathtub. So you are actually coming into the facility and manufacturing medicines. So I think this is going to be sort of the next wave of challenge for all of us is to try to source in already a scarce talent pool, the talent needed. To Raj's point earlier, right? The way that our industry has been able to raise capital during this time is unprecedented as well. So got so many more companies and all of us chasing really the same types of people.
Yeah, it sounds like employers are going to have to really work on being as transparent and communicative as they can with potential candidates then, right? Like trying to provide as many answers as they can to encourage those applications or to encourage people to accept offers. And it's difficult as an employer when you don't necessarily have 100% of all the answers, but trying to provide as much information as you can that you have at that point seems like might help with that, or at least, projecting that there is what that future looks like for that particular person and what they want and maybe what that flexibility is.
Another recommendation I'd make is really having companies, when they are in the hiring process, really evaluate and examine their onboarding process, because it is so different now. And what you tend to find when you audit it is that there's the implicit or explicit gaps that could potentially be there, things that are being trained on the side that aren't a part of your official program that would normally get picked up when they're in person working side by side with somebody, that just naturally gets addressed. You start identifying those gaps and seeing them in your onboarding and training process. And so it also puts more responsibility on the employer that's doing the hiring to figure out, if you're bringing on a good employee, like, are you giving them all the resources that they need to be successful? Have you identified your own gaps to make sure that they can be onboarded and become productive members of your workforce as soon as possible?
Michael, I think that's such an important point, and for retention is so critically important right now too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's just all of us have a unique culture, right? In our companies. It's part of who we are. And look, I feel for the folks who come in new to a company right now, to our company right now, because you don't have those walking around conversations to see the culture in action, right? So you have to go the extra mile to create those for folks. And sometimes it's, creating a meeting that's just about, how are you, and getting to know the team together, and doing more of an icebreaker type conversation as opposed to a project update, and just really get to know folks better. And those are the challenges that I think we've got to find ways to creatively work through, especially as we're bringing, new folks into the company.
We've instituted a number of additional meetings, sort of group meetings in the schedule. And the recommendation to do that actually came from some of our newer employees who were having trouble, like, figuring out, like, getting the lay of the land, as it were. So we put in a number of, like, different groups and the whole team or whatever meetings into the calendar. And it's turned, I think that in and of itself has made the sort of remote part more has solved some of our productivity issues around all being remote, because at first I was like, oh, are we really going to want to do this? And now we just all look forward to it, because it's like, we save some of the conversations that we would have had to pick up the phone and find people. We save those for those group meetings, because we know we're all going to be there. So it's kind of like a Sunday dinner, if you will. We have, and we built a number. We once we did one, there's like several that kind of got into a regular thing. But again, the original suggestion came from a couple of the new employees were like, hey, can we just like all get together every once in a while, because we don't know what's going on with this, that, and the other thing. And it worked.
You can.
The only comment that I was going to add was, if there's ever a time, Chantal, that it's become important for your employees to be spokespersons for your company and really advocate that this is a great place to work.
Absolutely.
It has never been more important than now.
We're almost at time, so I'm going to offer everyone the final opportunity for any final thoughts. If there's anything else you'd like to add. I know there were a lot of questions that were sent through on the Q&A, and so we will be looking to address those in our follow-up. But any final comments from you before we have to sign off?
I just appreciate the opportunity to get together. I think that one of the things that we can all do is just spend more time sharing our best practices and our learnings and learning from one another. It was hard enough to go into the pandemic and work through it. We're going to find a whole nother list of issues to work with as we come out of it, right? And so we're going to have to continue to be talking with each other and learn with one another.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's great to hear my peers talking about their experiences as well. And it's a very timely and relevant topic for us as leaders in how we define the future of work, right? Whether it's a physical workspace or whether we really have a value proposition for working remotely and maybe somewhere in between. So I think this is a very important and topical subject.
I would love to add to that. It's been a privilege to be able to be part of this panel. I think the reason most of us are in our industry, are in biotechnology, is to provide patients with benefits of life-saving medicines. And that purpose, I think, is a really unique purpose, and it really sort of knits us all together. So I love the sharing. I love the fact that there is not one right answer. It's a continuum. And I'd love to keep the learning going.
Thank you very much for hosting this. I have to say, I've been taking some notes so that when I go to my team meeting tomorrow, I'm gonna
have all these fresh ideas.
A couple of things that we need to look at in terms of back to office and all of that. So thanks for the ideas as well.
Yeah, very much. Thank you for putting this together. I think yesterday I was approached by one of my employees that we brought on during COVID, And the question he brought up is like, what's the culture like? What's it like working here not during COVID? And I think this highlights it because it's like, well, I can tell you about that, but going forward, we're going to discover that together. And so it's the discussions like this that really help us pave the way. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for everyone listening. We will be sending through a link of the recording if there's anything you want to go back and look at again. And we're also going to be sending through links to the reports that were referenced and additional resources. Thanks so much for your time, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Great.